Thank you so much for being here today, Jonathan. Today we have Jonathan Jarecki, who is a 20-year-old biology and neuroscience student at Davidson College, and I would say is someone who is a passionate advocate of evidence-based wellness. You seem to be all in on the research and the science, and we're super excited to dive in on that. He is also the host of the Signal podcast. And I would say, just from how I found you, like just a really strong voice in this kind of sun positivity and sunlight as wellness movement, or just world of people trying to understand that. So, and you've been recognized by people like Andrew Huberman, which is really cool. And so just it's really impressive, somebody, your age making such an impact. So we're really excited to have you here. And one of my first questions is, how did you get into this? Like, where does this, you seem very passionate about sunlight in particular, and I'm sure other things as well, but especially that we've honed in on. And just curious, like, where that passion comes from for you.
Yeah. Well, first off, Dominic and Jessa, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to have this conversation. But yeah, so I was raised in a very holistic household, very alternative medicine. We had a big focus on prevention, and so wasn't raised going to the doctor or anything like that. My mom had a bunch of holistic remedies and things that if we were to get sick, which was very far and few between, we would if it would be a sore throat or a fever, and we would have different modalities to sort of alleviate those things. And so I was raised in that environment. I always tell people my infrared sauna is older than myself. We still have it in my garage downstairs. I think it's like 35 years old. So my parents have been on this wave for a while. So I was super fortunate to sort of be in that environment growing up, understanding how lifestyle impacts our long-term health and movement and detoxification protocols and all those sorts of things. Definitely huge pillars of health, no doubt about it. I sort of 3 years ago is when I started really diving deep into just the science and literature around everything in the health space, and really just all the practices that I was really raised around. Because before, it was just sort of my mom's belief that I had, and I was like, all right, if I have these beliefs around these things, and if I'm doing these things, I want to know why. Like, why am I doing them? Why am I going to infrared sauna? Why am I doing specific things? And so I started reading books, I started listening to podcasts, and I really started diving deep into the primary literature just around all health topics. And that's sort of where I came across sunlight. And I think a lot of people in the space have heard this podcast, but listen to a podcast with Andrew Huberman and Jack Cruz and Rick Rubin. It was a 7-hour podcast. Listened to that, was absolutely blown away. Started basically hearing different claims around things, started looking them up, and found out for them to be true. And there was a ton of just science backing this stuff up. And I fell in love with it because I think it is a huge section of health that I think people aren't talking about a whole ton. And that's, sunlight and just light environments in general. Especially in the health and wellness world, it's like diet, exercise. Once you got those two things, you're good. But I think there's so much more. I think one of those things is your light exposure and the light you're surrounded by. And I think it has a huge impact on your health. And it's so simple, right? I mean, obviously the science can get very technical, but what I love about it is the practical takeaway is super simple, which is really great for people to just start implementing in their lives. And I think there's no going back once you start implementing sort of, circadian biology and focusing on your light environment. There's really no going back. I've gotten some of my friends into it back up in school, and there's no going back for them. They're wearing their blue blockers at night and getting morning sunlight and all this stuff. So it's really awesome to sort of see that impact that it actually has on people's lives. And then obviously also we have tons of research backing it up, which is, yeah, like you said, something I love talking about, because I think, definitely in the sort of health and wellness world on social media, there can be a lot of claims out there that people at least very well be like the claim could very well be true, but they don't back it up with any scientific source. And I'm always like, I always want to see that scientific source, and at least so I can go look it up and actually read the study. And so that's sort of where I wanted to fill in that gap on social media, and started posting basically just what I was reading. I was reading these scientific papers for fun, and I was just wanting to share that with other people. And that's basically, my passion there is, I think if we can get this information in the hands of individuals, I think there's a lot of power to that, and people can start taking health into their own hands, because we're burdened with chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, the leading causes of death in the United States. The vast majority of it is absolutely preventable. And I think it's just, people just don't know. One, they don't even know that it's preventable in the first place, and they don't know how to prevent it. So I think getting that information out there, that one, it is preventable. Two, here are the ways to prevent these diseases. And I think that's really the main thing that, I'm super passionate about. And we need more people in the space talking about it. We need more podcasts like you. You guys are doing an awesome job. And it's like, if we can just keep sharing this information, I think that's like the biggest thing here. But yeah, that's sort of how I got to this point here.
Awesome. At what point, so growing up, it sounds like you were in a privileged, holistic wellness environment, and then that was like probably all you knew for a while. Like, at what point did you realize like you guys were doing things a little bit differently?
Yeah, so, I wasn't, like, homeschooled or anything like that, like, I went to yeah, I went to school, was around kids who, were living the standard American lifestyle, so I always obviously saw the other sort of side, but to me, I don't know, it was sort of just yeah, it was just normal what we did. I sort of saw what everyone else did as, like, the weird thing.
Right.
Whereas, for them, they saw what I did was the weird thing. But yeah, for me, it was like the life we lived was sort of the norm. I had 3 older siblings, so that was nice, having them in my environment doing the same things as me. So it wasn't like I was the only kid doing it. I had my siblings as well. But but yeah, I think definitely going to college and seeing your friends the entire day and seeing how they spend their nights and seeing how they spend their weekends, things like that. Seeing that was definitely a big wake up call for me of like, wow, like my generation is really, not focusing on their health. That's the bare minimum of what I can say there. It's like there's a lot going on there. And that's sort of where when I really saw and I was like, wow, people don't live like me at all,
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's not me like bragging or anything. I think, I want this whenever I share my story, I want it to sort of be an encouragement for people, like I always say, it's like growing up, and my mom will like testify to this, like we were never really sick. And like I said, it's like sore throat, fever, 48 hours maximum, never taken any pharmaceutical drug in my entire life. And I don't think there's a need if you understand the pillars of health and if you actually implement those pillars into your life, into your child's life. Obviously, if you're living the standard American lifestyle, I think you're going to have to take the standard American medications and do all those things. So that's sort of my perspective there on that. But yeah, going to your question, that's coming to college was definitely a big wake up call there, and seeing how kids actually live.
Yeah, I'm gonna add to that because I'm really curious your perspective, Jonathan, on this. Like, so I'm turning 30 in July, so like very soon. And one thing I'm like realizing
Turning
is
21 in
like
July.
happy. When's your birthday? There's a lot of synchronicity, right?
I
Like with
know.
the
Yeah, yeah,
location.
yeah.
Yeah,
July 22nd.
nice. So my wife, hers is July 23rd, mine's the 14th. Lots of July babies, especially in Jessica and I's family. Our brother Michael, he's the 16th as well. So it's
Nice.
great.
Cool.
But so like I remember like advocating for more biophilia and like the restorative power of nature and being outside in college, especially for college students, because one thing that's absolutely true is for the most part, study like really hard. You're spending a lot of time inside, whether it's the classroom or the extracurriculars you kind of like choose to do with your friends. And that was one of the stats that always really shook me to the size of the problem. And I can't remember specifically, but it was like most people spend the majority of their lives inside, right? And away from the sun. And the reason I bring up my age is because it seems like since that point, since I was in college with just getting into corporate America and like my experience with it, that really starts to set in, right? Because everything's very tied to devices. So I know you mentioned blue light blockers as a way to protect against that, but I wonder if we could just like chat about this for a second, get some perspective on people, how they can like counteract that and just like their day to day.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. I definitely, being in school, I have to focus on my light environment more than when I'm at home. At home, I can control all my lighting at home and things like that. But obviously, when I'm at school, when I'm in the classroom, obviously I can't control the lighting there. Our club meetings are always very late into the night because that's when everyone's free. So, like in that scenario, when I step into a club meeting late at night, I'll have my amber tinted blue blockers. I'll have a hat as well because we want to limit light coming in from the top of the eye down into the retina. I'll have as much skin covered up as possible because our skin cells also have melanopsin, which is a photopigment that absorbs blue light and sort of has a role in the
Wow.
peripheral circadian clocks on our skin. Our skin has a circadian system as well. Every single organ has its own circadian clock as well as a central timekeeper. So yeah, I always take the furthest approach to sort of mitigate against, let's say, artificial light at night to the best that I can. I look weird, but like I don't care. It's for my health. So
It looks
you know,
mysterious.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a better way to put it. And when I'm at school, I prioritize getting, if I can, sunrise every single morning. If it's not sunrise, second I wake up, I go right outside, get bright morning light into the eyes. But I think it's it's like that's a simple thing, like getting outside when you wake up. A lot of kids, my age, they'll wake up and they'll start scrolling on their phone in bed, stay in bed for however long they stay in bed for, and they're scrolling on their phone. That's the first light they're exposed to, which is a huge problem because we need that bright morning light to set that circadian timekeeper. And yeah, so I think that's definitely some practical things that I implement in my life. And whenever I have a time to get outside, I'm out there. So before a class, I'll be like at a bench, even if it's just 5 minutes, basking in like the midday sun before I enter into class. And so it's just things like that. Whenever I have a little break, lunch, I'm always outside for lunch. Even on cold days in North Carolina, I'll be all my friends will see me outside eating lunch, and I've gotten some of them to come out with me, which is fun. But yeah, it's always trying to do your best. Obviously, it's never going to be perfect, especially when it relates to light environment. I could talk about like food as well. I eat in the cafeteria, so try my best to, because you can definitely eat very, very unhealthy in a school cafeteria, but you can also eat pretty healthy in a school cafeteria as well. You just need to play with it, and maybe it takes a little bit more effort, but it can definitely be done. And that's sort of where I've been. It's like yeah, it takes a little bit more effort, but can definitely be done in living a healthy lifestyle that way.
Awesome.
So, okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
People always talk about like morning light, and you mentioned it, like get out in the morning. It's all about that morning light to set your circadian rhythm. But can you speak to the differences between other times of daylight and even like what morning versus evening light? Like what are the things we're going for? Like what should we know about that?
Sure. Yeah. Morning light has sort of two effects. So especially, I'll start at like sunrise, right? So when the sun first comes above the horizon, you're getting sort of two stimuli. So one, you're getting a circadian stimulus. So not only is the brightness of the light setting your circadian rhythm in the morning, but also the contrast. So during sunrise, you have that orange, red. I'm at the horizon and it's blue right above the sun. And that contrast, that yellow, blue, orange, blue contrast in the sky basically tells our cells, our cones in our eyes, relays this signal to these special cells called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And these ganglion cells are non-visual forming. So they don't help with our visual system. They simply tell our suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is our central timekeeper, our circadian clock in our brain, what time of day it is. And so that sunrise, that contrast in the sky is helping with that stimulus. So it's telling your body that it's sunrise, it's time to do these things. It's regulating different hormones. The two main ones people probably are very familiar with is cortisol and melatonin. So in the morning, we actually want high cortisol levels. So cortisol is not necessarily this bad hormone. So cortisol is essentially a glucocorticoid. What that means is that
because when I think cortisol, I just think of like basic neurobiology or whatever. I think it's like stress hormone.
Yeah, exactly.
I know that's like way oversimplification from what it sounds like.
Yeah. So most people think of cortisol as like the stress, and it's a bad hormone. That's what most people think about. And it's not necessarily bad, right? So cortisol, glucocorticoid. And what that means is it helps shuttle glucose throughout the body and helps utilize glucose. So think about, in our primordial existence when we're living outside and maybe a tiger is chasing us or whatever, we're in a stressful event. During those stressful events, we would typically need glucose for our muscles. Because typically we would need, let's say if we're running away from something or whatever it may be, we would need glucose. So cortisol in that event spikes, and then it allows glucose to go into the muscles. Now, we have what's called this cortisol awakening response curve. So in the morning, cortisol is super high, and then it goes lower and lower throughout the day. And then at the end of the day, cortisol should be very low if we have a proper cortisol awakening response curve, if we're getting bright morning light into the eyes, and melatonin will then go high at night if we have a lack of light. So if we have artificial light at night, then melatonin is not going to be able to be produced. Melatonin is going to be suppressed. But going back to this morning light, so right, we're getting that circadian stimulus. Cortisol is going to be really high if we get more morning light, and we want that. That's very healthy, and that will also
on the same token as you were saying about like nighttime. Do you want like more of your skin exposed during those times as well, or like is that it's kind of like opposite of the nighttime routine?
Yeah. So that sort of gets to the second point. So like I said, there's two sort of things with the morning light. One, you're getting that circadian stimulus, but then also, especially during sunrise and throughout the day, but it's highly concentrated at sunrise, you're getting tons of red and near infrared light. And these red and near infrared light wavelengths have they affect our mitochondria. So our mitochondria, these little organelles inside of every single one of our cells. We have thousands of mitochondria inside of one cell. We have trillions of cells, tons of mitochondria. And red and infrared light is able to, so one of the key things that you need to understand here is that red and infrared light can penetrate through the entire body. So if you can shine red light on or near infrared light on the chest, and it will penetrate all the way through the back. But not a lot of it comes out the back. So most of it actually gets absorbed, and it's getting absorbed by the mitochondria, essentially supercharging your mitochondria like batteries. That's what mitochondria are. They're basically these little tiny batteries. There's a proton gradient, and when red and infrared
The
light gets
powerhouse of
absorbed,
the cell,
the
right?
powerhouse of the cell. There you go.
Hashtag.
Yep. Yeah, that's sort of like the simplified way of, and that's what we learn in like all entry level bio classes is they're the powerhouse of cell, but there's so much more than that, and it's really fascinating diving into mitochondrial research. There's great people doing some awesome research out of University of Columbia. Martin Picard and his wife Narosha Murugan, they're doing some really fantastic research around mitochondria. But anyways, getting to so this morning light, you're getting the red and infrared light at a high concentration, supercharging your mitochondria essentially. And that sort of gets to your question of should we have more skin exposed? My suggestion is, especially if you're going out there during sunrise, have as much skin exposed as possible,
Mm.
appropriately wherever you may be. And so getting that
I'll
skin
just go in the
exposed,
middle of like a field on the farm and just,
yeah, there you go.
Do it. Just go all out. Yeah.
Getting those wavelengths on as much of the skin as possible, that's going to have interactions with the skin. And what that actually helps with later in the day is you're going to have a better resilience for midday sun exposure. So we have beautiful papers showing that infrared and red light, when we shine that on skin prior to UV exposure, it actually helps mitigate the potential harms of too much ultraviolet exposure in the middle of the day. So getting that sort of preconditioning of the skin with the red and infrared light in the morning is going to help tolerate more midday sun throughout the day and when the UV is higher. So those are the two main things that I focus on when I'm thinking about morning sunlight. And again, for timing here, because I think that's really important. So I would, let's say it's a clear day, no clouds, anything like that, minimum of 15 minutes, minimum. Now, if you can do more, that's always better. So if you can get 30, if you can get an hour, that's amazing. If you don't have time for that, if you only have time for 15 minutes, that's still great. You're still going to get that circadian stimulus. Now, on an overcast day, I would lean towards that more 30-minute to an hour mark, just because it is going to be less dim. You're going to have less of a circadian stimulus. You're also going to have less infrared light coming through the atmosphere because the clouds will absorb some of the infrared light. You're still getting tons more infrared light than you will be in an indoor environment. Indoor environments are completely void of infrared light. So being outdoors, no matter if it's cloudy or if it's clear, you're going to get those benefits either way. So that's sort of the morning sunlight. I don't know if you had any other parts of the question that I missed there, but
No, just only like, what about evening sunlight? Because that's
yes, okay.
obviously different than midday. So what's,
Yep,
yeah.
exactly.
All right,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna throw something into this too when you make
Sure.
your answer, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Talk to me about like the data you're seeing on this and whether that's stuff or studies that you've run yourself, or just things that you've corroborated. Because I find like the timing like interesting, like 15 minutes for the day, an hour for overcast. From an intuitive point of view, like it definitely makes sense. And I'm just like, I'd be fascinated to see if there's any studies on that as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll hit on that point first, and then get to midday sun exposure in terms of the 15, 30-minute mark there. So I'll take both of those sort of perspectives of the circadian and the mitochondrial stimulation. So
Yeah.
from the circadian perspective, the research is pretty clear that around 15 minutes is when that system is going to register the light. So we want that 15-minute minimum, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then overcast day, the only reason it's a little bit more is because it's more dim. So when the circadian system gets stimulated by a few things. One, the contrast during sunrise, but then even let's say after the sunrise, as the sun is rising higher and higher, the contrast is going away. And then what's happening is you're going to be getting more blue light. So you're going to get more blue light. It's also going to become more brighter, and then the angle is going to be coming up. So what sets the circadian system is not only the contrast, but also the blueness of the light, the brightness of the light, and then the angle of the light. So really, the longer you stay out there, if it's overcast or clear, no matter what, the longer you stay out there, you're just going to continue sort of sending that signal to these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells in your eyes to then the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. So you're just going to have a further stimulation of that, which is then going to entrain that clock even further. And really what you're doing is you're anchoring the system. You can think about it like that. So in the morning, the more light you can get into the eyes in the morning, you're going to have a stronger anchor on that circadian clock. And this circadian clock governs every single cell, every single organ of our body. And it's essentially just, these fluctuations in hormones, the fluctuation in proteins that are being produced, the fluctuations in DNA repair. So it's really everything, and so that's sort of the timing frame there. Now, from a wavelength mitochondrial perspective, when we're looking at the red and infrared wavelengths, the same sort of time frame also applies. So I'll reference Glenn Jeffrey. He's out of University College London. He's one of the pioneer researchers on how light interacts, especially long wavelength light interacts with the mitochondria. And he's seeing that we really want that minimum of that 15 minutes of red and infrared light is what is going to sort of, get the mitochondrial sort of function to get to its peak, and then really it sort of plateaus. But so there's let me reference one paper here because I think this will help better explain this. So Glenn Jeffrey, he did this amazing paper where he shined red light on participants' back, a very small area of their back, and he did what's called an oral glucose tolerance test. So he made the participants drink a ton of glucose, he shined the red light, then he monitored their glucose every 15 minutes for the next 2 hours. And he looked at what would happen if from the two groups, right? The control group that didn't get the red light shine, and then the experimental group that got the red light shine on their back. And what he saw when comparing the groups is that the group that got the red light shine on their back had a reduction in blood glucose. The reason for that, and he had a couple other experiments in this study that pointed to this explanation, is that the mitochondria essentially were running faster, they were running harder because they're getting the red light shine on them. And since they're running harder, they need more glucose, which is their fuel source. They need more fuel. So they're going to take that glucose from the bloodstream. And in turn, you're going to have a lower blood glucose levels. So what we're seeing there, is essentially just showing that we are sort of deprived of this red and infrared light. And really what we're seeing is just we're getting back to baseline. So really the baseline level of where our blood glucose is when the red light is being shined, because when we look at this evolutionarily, we would have been bathed in the red and infrared light throughout the day. So I bring this up really to point to the fact that this 15 minutes of the red and infrared light exposure is really getting us to that sort of baseline and getting us to that plateau. So there's sort of a threshold of benefit. Once you get more than 15 minutes, you're not going to have an increased benefit, but you're going to still stay at that sort of, homeostatic response of where your body should be. So ideally you continue to get more because your body wants more of it, but you're not going to have a continuous sort of benefit, if that makes sense. So that's sort of that 15-minute, minimum that you want there for both of those mechanisms. And then, so going to the middle of the day, as the day continues after sunrise, you're gonna have, obviously it's gonna be getting brighter, and then in the middle of the day, you're gonna have more of those shorter wavelengths of light. You're still gonna have tons of infrared. So if we look at midday sun and what that spectrum actually looks like, 50% of the solar spectrum is infrared light. Around 45-ish is, give or take these numbers, is visible light. So that's the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, violet. And then just beyond violet is UV, ultraviolet. And ultraviolet consists of around less than 10% of the solar spectrum. The majority of ultraviolet is UVA, because even UV can be split up, UVA and then UVB. UVB is what produces vitamin D. UVA does not produce vitamin D. Only 0.13% of the solar spectrum is UVB. So the vast majority of UV is UVA. So that's sort of the solar spectrum, and that's midday. So in the middle of the day, right, we're going to be exposed to the shorter wavelengths of light, and they're obviously having a ton of, biological relevancies there. UVB, as I mentioned, produces vitamin D, but we also know that UVA mobilizes nitric oxide. So we have nitric oxide stores in our dermis of our skin. So our skin stores nitric oxide, this small, super small molecule that has really profound effects on our cardiovascular system. So nitric oxide, when it goes into our blood vessels, it vasodilates our blood vessels, basically opening the blood vessels up, allowing more blood flow, reducing blood pressure, and then we can improve cardiovascular outcomes. And so what we see is when we shine UVA light on participants, on humans, we have increased amounts of nitric oxide in the blood. We see blood pressure drop. And then when we look at epidemiological studies, which are just these big cohort observational studies of participants and seeing how much sun exposure they get, we see that people who get more sun exposure have a reduction in cardiovascular disease to a great magnitude. Which then sort of, the mechanism there is that nitric oxide that we think. That's what you're getting with with midday sun. At the same time, you don't want to burn. So, most people, I think, when they think about sun exposure, they think, oh, I'm going to burn and that's not good. And burning is not good, right? We don't want to burn. So we want to get sensible sun exposure. We want to get smart sun exposure. We want to gradually build up a tan, and we want to gradually build that sun exposure. We want to get sun exposure regularly. It's that chronic, regular sun exposure that's what's really beneficial. Whereas intermittent sun exposure, when, let's say you're indoors for a whole week and then on the weekend you go to the beach and you fry, and that's not good. We don't want that. So we want sort of that regular sun exposure and getting that safe sun exposure. So that's sort of the middle of the day of what you're getting there.
What was it about evening? Did you say that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So evening.
Yeah.
You really same thing. So with the evening, similar to sunrise, you're gonna sort of again anchor that circadian system for nighttime. And
Okay.
in the evening, once the sun sets, we want as little light into our eyes and onto our skin, but mainly focusing on the eyes. We want little amount of light into the eyes as possible. And you think about this, from a primordial perspective, we would have never been exposed to shorter wavelengths of blue light, let's say, after the sun set. If the first artificial light that humans created was fire, right? But our biology is pretty adapted to firelight for a few reasons. One, when I said at the beginning of this, what stimulates the circadian system is the blueness, the brightness, and the angle. Now,
Mm-hmm.
with firelight, we have low blue, we have very little brightness, so it's very dim, and the angle is below us, right? The sun is never below us; the sun's always above us, and that's why the sun stimulates the circadian system. So when we have firelight we're very much adapted to because it doesn't have very much blue, it is very dim, and the angle is below us. So that does not stimulate that circadian system. And then it allows melatonin to be produced at night, which is what we want, this sleep molecule that's also a very potent antioxidant. And so at night, you want to have those dim lights, have the lights not have tons of short wavelength blue in them, and keeping that really dark environment, again, going to anchor that circadian system for nighttime. And then, you sort of just revolve and do the whole thing again, get bright morning light into the eyes in the morning, and then anchor that circadian system for morning light as well.
So, like, in terms of what you were commenting on before about just the typical kind of like American lifestyle diet, all those things, and all the chronic diseases and those things that are happening, how important, in your opinion, is that integration of sunlight into like all of those health factors for people? Like, is it at a level where like people might not realize how important it really is? Or I'm just curious.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I would point to some of the, observational studies we have. I really like to point to three main ones. So the first one was a epidemiological, observational study out of Sweden. So what these researchers did was they took 30,000 Swedish women. They surveyed them to basically gauge their average amount of sun exposure. So this is via survey. So obviously there's some limitations there. They surveyed them to gauge the average amount of sun exposure, and then they categorized them into three groups: the low UV, medium UV, and high UV. And essentially what they saw, they tracked these women for 20 years to see their health outcomes. So seeing if they were dying, seeing what they were dying from for those 20 years. And what they saw was that the woman who got the least amount of sun exposure had the greatest mortality rate. So compared to the woman who got the most amount of sun exposure. So if you got the more sun you got, the lower your mortality from all cause. So all cause mortality, meaning mortality from cardiovascular, mortality for deadly cancers, and you had a reduction in the mortality just from getting more sun exposure. Now, this paper was then sort of replicated on a much larger scale. So these researchers out of the UK utilized what's called the UK Biobank, which is essentially this really, really awesome data set of people in the UK, and they have tons of data on these individuals. They took 400,000 of these individuals. They surveyed them to gauge their average amount of sun exposure. But what they also did in this study was they also tested their vitamin D levels. And we know vitamin D is a great proxy for how much sun exposure someone gets. So if people who get more sun exposure have greater vitamin D levels. And then they also looked at satellite images of how much sun exposure a particular area that these individuals were living in had and got throughout the year. They took all that. And again, what they saw was the exact same thing, but they were actually looking at specific outcomes. So they were looking at all-cause mortality, and they were also looking at a cardiovascular mortality, and then also non-skin cancer mortality. And what they saw, same exact thing. the more sun exposure somebody got, and this was dose dependent. So as you increase the amount of sun exposure, you increase the reduction in cardiovascular death and non-skin cancer deaths. So what we're seeing there is as people get more sun exposure, they're one increasing their lifespan, but they're also they have a reduction in these very deadly diseases and these chronic diseases. Now, I think it's important to touch on this one last paper here, which is in preprint right now. So preprint essentially, these researchers can publish a paper which is not yet published, hasn't gone through peer review. They can put it on a preprint server for people to see. So that's where this paper is at right now. It's not under peer reviewed. It's not published yet, but needless to say, it's an amazing study, and I think it's important to talk about it. And when it gets published, it's going to be even better, and people will start sharing it more. But essentially what they did, again, they took a cohort of around 400,000 participants. They created what's called a sunbeam score, basically categorizing these participants again in how much sun exposure they got, low UV, medium UV, high UV, saw the same exact outcomes. Now, what's really interesting with this study is they were also looking at skin cancers, basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and melanoma. They were looking at those skin cancers as well. And they were the main sort of outcome that they were looking at in this study was the risk-benefit ratio of sun exposure, because we do know that there are potential risks. As we see in the epidemiological evidence, as you get more sun exposure, you do increase your risk of basal cell and squamous cell carcinomas, which these are skin cancers that, obviously I don't want anyone to get any type of skin cancer, but they're not no one's dying from these sort of skin cancer. Most people are dying, if they are dying from skin cancers, they're dying from melanoma because, basal cell and squamous cell, they're very easily treated as long as they're detected. You go to the doctor and they take it right off, and it's not a huge deal. So we do see that increase. So there is a potential risk there, but obviously, like I've mentioned in these past studies, there's also potential benefit with a reduction in cardiovascular disease and non-skin cancers. So when they took all the data that they had and they basically took the numbers down into one small little ratio. They did some data analysis looking at the risk-benefit ratio here. And when they put it down into one ratio, if they put every single person from the high UV category and they put them in the low UV category. So let's say, we're telling all these people who are getting a ton of sun, telling them, go indoors, don't get sun. What they saw was that they would save one life from a skin cancer death. However, you would lose 75 lives from all other causes. So that's cardiovascular and non-skin cancers. So that was the risk-benefit ratio that they saw. And then obviously vice versa, if we put everyone in the high UV category, so we took all the people who were not getting a lot of sun, put them in the high UV category, they got more sun, we saw that we would lose one life from skin cancer because more people would be getting sun exposure, but we would gain those 75 other lives back from cardiovascular and non-skin cancers. So, clearly without a doubt, looking at the literature, there is a greater benefit than there is a risk to sun exposure. And then, I'll also just put the caveat on the increase in squamous cell and basal cell carcinomas from more sun exposure. There's obviously a lot other things that go into that. When we're looking at those populations, they are what's considered in the scientific field as a healthy population, but we know very well that even these people aren't what I would at least consider a healthy population. What they mean by healthy population is that they don't have cardiovascular disease yet. They don't have diabetes yet. So that's what they consider a healthy population. But, these people their circadian rhythm is completely, out of line just because that's what every single person in the entire world is. Basically, there's some beautiful papers on this and some researchers have published and basically stating that pretty much everyone in our modern society is a shift worker because they are being exposed to artificial light at night. And that we know that increases your risk of skin cancers. So, even with that increased risk of the basal cell and squamous cell, what we're seeing observationally with more sun exposure, there is obviously nuance to that as well. So I think there's ways to get plenty of sun exposure without even increasing your risk of that. I think, we don't have the greatest evidence there just again, because we're not looking at a population that is, what I would consider a healthy population. So that's sort of the midday sun exposure there and sort of the risks and the benefits that we're seeing.
It's pretty compelling to get sunlight then, according to that.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, it's fascinating, especially the nitrogen oxide or something like that?
Yep, nitric oxide.
Nitric oxide, yeah. I had no idea. And I think the more people kind of learn about this, it make better decisions. So I just really appreciate your expertise. It's such a fascinating space. And so glad that the conversation's really grown and people are starting to understand the power of sunlight in their lives and how to do it in a responsible way, right? But a way that's, to save 70 lives right?
Yeah,
just
exactly
with the right type of habit.
Exactly. I'll give people one good resource on this if they want to dive really deep into this. is there's a brand new book that just came out, like I think earlier last week. It's called In Defense of Sunlight. I don't know if you guys saw
I
this,
just
but
bought it. I have it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know. I don't even know the author of it. I mean, I'm gonna get him on my podcast to have a discussion about it. But I've never met
Yeah.
him. I have no affiliation with the book at all. But I started listening to it. I just got on an audiobook. I'm on like chapter 6 right now. It's absolutely amazing. He talks about the nitric oxide. He talks about these observational studies that aren't really talked about a whole ton. So it's a great. I think it's an amazing starting place for people to really dive deeper into it. So far from what I've listened to it so far, it's been a really, really great book. And his name is Rowan Jacobson. He's done a fantastic job, I think. But yeah, that's just a good resource, I think, for people to sort of get started there.
Great recommendation. Thank you. This is like so informative, and I'm sure we both have like a million more questions, but really appreciate your time coming on and sharing. And I know it'll be definitely helpful and beneficial to a lot of people who will hear what you had to say about the tips and how to maximize your sun exposure in the most healthy ways. I think that's very important.
Yeah, no, thank you guys for having me. This is a fun conversation. Got to keep spreading the message. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you guys having me on to do that.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Let's go get some sunlight. And thank you, Jonathan, for being on our show. Please follow him on Instagram, learn all of the fascinating insights into the research and the science behind why sunlight is so powerful for you and the Signal podcast. And until next time, Jonathan, let's make sure we get some sunlight. You're always welcome out at the farm. So we can go out on a hike or something.
I love it.